No, Nanny lasted a week with the millionaire CEO's triplets until she showed up and did what he never expected. Hi, my beautiful family. Let's begin with a prayer, not just for me, but for all of us. Dear God, please watch over me as I go through this treatment. Surround me with your healing light, guide every doctor's hand, calm every fear, and restore my strength. And Lord, I also lift up my entire YouTube family, every subscriber, every listener. Bless them with health, peace, and joy. Let your love protect each heart that supports me. Amen. This is your Mr. Peter. I'm still in New York receiving treatment, and though I may be far in distance, I carry each of you so close to my heart. I know not hearing my voice today may leave some of you feeling disappointed, and I truly understand. But please, my beautiful family, don't leave the story because of this long message. It's a humble request. Many new family members sometimes exit before the story begins. You can skip the introduction if you like, but please stay for the story. And if it touches you, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. I read them all, with love and gratitude. While I'm healing, James is here to continue the journey with care, respect, and the same heart I've always shared with you. Please keep praying for me as I continue praying for you. Now, let's begin today's story with faith, with hope, and with the love that keeps us forever connected.
Greg Chaffee was a billionaire who could buy anything in the world except the one thing he desperately needed: someone brave enough to stay in the same room as his children for longer than 24 hours. Standing in the wreckage of what used to be his pristine Manhattan penthouse, 37 floors above the city that never slept, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Central Park and interiors that had graced the pages of Architectural Digest, Greg surveyed the aftermath of Nanny No. 15's dramatic exit. Finger paint in shades of emerald and magenta streaked the hand-painted Italian wallpaper that cost more per square foot than most people's monthly salary. Tiny, muddy footprints, still damp from this morning's archaeological expedition in the building's rooftop garden, tracked across Persian rugs that had been woven by masters in Isfahan. And somewhere in the distance came the ominous sound of running water from places where water definitely shouldn't be running, in a penthouse that had more smart home technology than most NASA facilities. Aurelia, Caspian, Delphine. His voice carried the authority that commanded boardrooms and billion-dollar deals, but the three 6-year-old architects of chaos who shared his DNA were conspicuously absent from their crime scene. Mrs. Henderson, his long-suffering housekeeper, appeared in the doorway with a broom and dustpan, her weathered face carrying the resignation of someone who had witnessed this exact scenario 14 times before. "They're hiding in the library, Mr. Chaffee, behind the Shakespeare collection." Greg ran his hands through his dark hair, the perfectly styled waves now disheveled from stress. At 38, he commanded a tech empire worth billions, could negotiate deals that made or broke companies, and had been featured on Forbes' cover 3 times. Yet 3 small humans who barely reached his waist had reduced him to the edge of a nervous breakdown. "What did they do this time?" he asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know. "Well, sir," Mrs. Henderson began carefully, "it started with the crickets in your briefcase during the board meeting this morning." Greg's jaw tightened. The memory was still fresh, opening his Hermes briefcase in front of potential investors only to have dozens of crickets leap out, chirping their way across the conference table while his business partners dove for cover. The deal worth $50 million had been postponed indefinitely. "Then there was the incident with Miss Caroline's lunch," Mrs. Henderson continued. "They may have replaced her sandwich filling with toothpaste and possibly released a family of mice they'd rescued from the park into her bedroom." Greg closed his eyes, feeling the familiar throb of a stress headache building behind his temples. Caroline Morrison had been perfect on paper, Harvard-educated, 5 years of experience with high-profile families, impeccable references. She'd lasted exactly 4 hours. And the Voss, a culmination, sir. Something about Chapter 2, the Hurricane Whisperer. Barbara Leslie had faced down hurricanes, forest fires, and a particularly memorable incident involving 20 escaped zoo animals, but nothing had prepared her for the tactical warfare that was breakfast with the Chaffee triplets. "Miss Barbara," Delphine said sweetly, her cherubic face the picture of innocence as she stirred something suspicious into Barbara's orange juice. "Do you believe in magic?" It was day 3 of Barbara's employment, and she'd already survived the great shampoo avalanche, every bottle in the house somehow creating a slippery obstacle course down the main staircase. The mystery of the vanishing homework, later discovered redecorated with glitter and transformed into modern art, and what the children called Operation Invisible Breakfast, their attempt to convince her that cereal should be eaten with chocolate sauce and marshmallows. "I believe in the magic of children who think they're cleverer than adults," Barbara replied, calmly fishing what appeared to be a plastic spider out of her juice. "Particularly when they use the same tricks their father probably used when he was 6. Caspian dropped his spoon with a clatter. "How did you know?" "Because creative minds think alike," Barbara said, winking at him. "Your father probably put salt in someone's coffee when he was your age." From the kitchen doorway came a deep chuckle that sent an unexpected warmth through Barbara's chest. Greg Chaffee stood there in his impeccably tailored charcoal suit, but for the first time since she'd arrived, he looked amused. "It was pepper in my stepmother's tea," he admitted, straightening his tie, "though I was 7 and considerably less sophisticated in my methods." "Daddy was naughty too," Aurelia gasped with delight. "Daddy was a terror," Mrs. Henderson called from the kitchen, her voice carrying decades of fond memories. "Nearly gave his poor mother gray hair before she was 30. Barbara watched Greg's face soften as he looked at his children, and something inside her chest did a little flip. This was the man she'd glimpsed yesterday, not the intimidating billionaire, but the father who loved his babies fiercely and was trying desperately not to fail them. "All right, hurricanes," Barbara said, standing and clapping her hands together. "Time for Hurricane Barbara's first law of physics." "What's that?" all 3 children asked in unison. "For every action of mischief there is an equal and opposite reaction of consequence. But," she held up a finger as their faces fell, "consequences can be fun if you're creative enough." Greg paused in the act of reaching for his briefcase. "What exactly are you suggesting?" "Well," Barbara said thoughtfully, "someone needs to clean up the shampoo on the stairs. That someone could do it the boring way with a mop, or—" She trailed off dramatically. "Or," Caspian prompted eagerly, "or they could clean it up by sliding down it in socks and turning it into the world's most epic slip-and-slide, under adult supervision, of course." The children's eyes widened to the size of dinner plates. Greg's mouth opened, then closed, then opened again. "You want them to slide down my marble staircase?" he asked faintly. "I want them to take responsibility for their actions while learning that cleaning up can be just as fun as making the mess," Barbara corrected gently. "Besides, it's the most efficient way to spread the soap around so we can rinse it properly." "Can we, Daddy?" "Please." Delphine bounced on her toes, her dark curls dancing. Greg looked at Barbara as if she'd just suggested they all jump off the roof with umbrellas. But then he saw his children's faces, hopeful, excited, genuinely happy for the first time in weeks, and his resistance crumbled. "Fine," he said slowly, "but I want photos for evidence when the insurance company asks questions." The next hour was controlled chaos of the most delightful kind. Barbara had the children change into old clothes and supervised as they took turns sliding down the soapy stairs in their socks, squealing with laughter as they went. She'd strategically placed towels at the bottom for soft landings and turned the rinsing process into a game of soap bubble popping contest. Greg had intended to leave for the office immediately after breakfast, but found himself lingering by the window of his home office, watching the spectacle below. Barbara had somehow managed to make his children clean while having the time of their lives. Even more incredibly, she was laughing right along with them, her joyous voice mixing with theirs in a symphony of pure happiness that he hadn't heard in his house since Elena died. "She's remarkable," Mrs. Henderson said softly, appearing beside him with a cup of coffee. "She's unconventional," Greg corrected, though his eyes never left the scene below where Barbara was now teaching the children how to make soap sculptures with the remaining bubbles. "She's exactly what this family needs," Mrs. Henderson said firmly. "Those children have smiled more in 3 days than they have in 3 months." Greg knew she was right, but watching Barbara with his children stirred something in him that he'd thought died with Elena. A longing for partnership, for someone to share the weight of parenthood, for warmth in the cold spaces of his life. And that terrified him more than any hostile takeover ever had. "Daddy," Aurelia's voice called from below, "come see my soap castle." Before Greg could object, Barbara looked up and met his eyes through the window. "Your CEO skills are needed for proper architectural consultation," she called with a grin that made his stomach do things that were entirely inappropriate for 10 in the morning. Against his better judgment, Greg found himself downstairs, kneeling on his expensive marble floor, examining soap sculptures that his children had made. Barbara knelt beside him, close enough that he could smell her subtle perfume, something warm and vanilla-sweet that made him want to lean closer. "This one's a dragon," Caspian explained seriously, pointing to a lumpy creation that looked more like abstract art. "He guards the soap princess in her soap tower." "And this is their soap baby," Delphine added, indicating a smaller lump. "Because everyone needs a family." Greg's throat tightened at the innocence in her voice, the unconscious longing for the complete family they'd once been. "It's magnificent," he said softly, and meant it. Not because the sculptures were particularly artistic, but because his children had made them, because they were smiling, because for the first time in months they seemed genuinely happy. "Now we need to rinse everything clean," Barbara announced. "Who knows the best technique for bubble elimination?" What followed was a lesson in practical physics disguised as playtime. Barbara showed them how to use spray bottles to create patterns, how water pressure affected bubble behavior, and how teamwork made the job faster. By the end, the stairs were spotless. The children were thoroughly soaked but delighted, and Greg was staring at Barbara with something approaching awe. "How did you do that?" he asked when the children had gone to change into dry clothes. "Do what?" Barbara was wringing out towels, her own clothes damp but her smile radiant. "Make them want to clean up their own mess." "Children aren't naturally destructive," she said thoughtfully. "They're naturally curious. When you channel that curiosity into positive action instead of trying to suppress it, amazing things happen." Greg watched her efficient movements, the gentle way she folded each towel, the unconscious hum she made while working. "You're not like any nanny I've ever met." "Good," Barbara said, meeting his eyes with a directness that made his pulse jump. "Because your children aren't like any children I've ever met either. They're special, Greg. They just need someone who recognizes their specialness as a gift instead of a problem." The way she said his name, not Mr. Chaffee but Greg, warm and familiar, sent heat racing through his veins. For a moment they stood there in the elegant foyer, surrounded by the lingering scent of soap bubbles and the echo of children's laughter, and Greg felt something shift in the foundation of his carefully controlled world. "Daddy," Aurelia's voice shattered the moment as she appeared at the top of the stairs in fresh clothes. "Miss Barbara promised to teach us how to make pancakes that look like animals for lunch." Did she now? Greg asked, his voice slightly hoarse. Assuming that's all right with you, Barbara said quickly. I don't want to overstep. Barbara, Greg interrupted gently, and watched her eyes widen at the intimacy in his voice. You have my permission to teach them whatever you think they should learn. The smile that bloomed across her face was like sunrise after the longest night, and Greg realized with startling clarity that somewhere between the cricket incident and the soap sculptures, this remarkable woman had begun to heal his broken family. The question was, what was she going to do to his carefully guarded heart? As if sensing the weight of his thoughts, Barbara's eyes softened. Sometimes the best lessons come disguised as the most fun, she said quietly. And Greg had the unsettling suspicion she wasn't talking about pancakes at all. Chapter 3. Cracks in the Ice. The sound of Greg Chaffee's home office door slamming shut was so violent it made the crystal chandelier in the foyer tremble, and that was nothing compared to the trembling in 6-year-old Aurelia's bottom lip as she stood in her school costume, waiting for a father who wasn't going to come. "Where is he?" she whispered to Barbara, her golden curls adorned with a construction paper crown that proclaimed her the starring role of Autumn Leaf Princess in Madison Prep's annual fall pageant. Barbara's heart shattered into approximately 7 million pieces as she knelt to Aurelia's level, adjusting the little girl's orange and red tissue paper dress that they'd spent all afternoon perfecting. Through the office's frosted glass doors, she could hear Greg's voice, sharp and commanding as he conducted yet another emergency conference call that was apparently more important than watching his daughter fulfill her dream of being royalty for one magical evening. Sometimes grown-ups get confused about what's really important, Barbara said gently, tucking a wayward curl behind Aurelia's ear. But that doesn't mean you're not the most beautiful princess in the entire kingdom. Daddy promised, Aurelia said, and the simple devastation in those 2 words made Barbara want to march into that office and give Greg Chaffee a piece of her mind that would make his board meetings seem like kindergarten tea parties. Instead, she took a deep breath and made a decision that would change everything. You know what, Princess Aurelia? Barbara said, standing and extending her arm in a formal gesture. Every princess deserves a royal escort to her grand debut. Would you do me the honor of allowing me to accompany you to your coronation? Aurelia's eyes widened. You want to come see my play? Sweetheart, I wouldn't miss it for all the kingdoms in the world. An hour later, Barbara sat in the front row of Madison Prep's auditorium, cheering louder than any parent as Aurelia delivered her lines about the changing seasons with the gravitas of someone accepting an Academy Award. Her heart swelled with pride as if this beautiful, brave little girl were her own daughter. And when Aurelia spotted her in the audience and waved with such joy that her tissue paper crown slipped sideways, Barbara had to dab at her eyes with the emergency tissues she'd learned to carry since joining the Chaffee household. But when they returned home at 8:30, glowing with triumph and carrying Aurelia's participation ribbon like a trophy, Greg's office door was still closed, the sound of his voice still carrying through the glass as he discussed quarterly projections that would matter exactly 0% when he was 90 and looking back on the moments he'd missed. I'm going to show Daddy my ribbon, Aurelia announced, marching toward the office with the determination of a general planning a siege. Sweetheart, maybe we should wait until... Barbara began, but Aurelia was already pushing open the heavy door. Daddy, look what I won. Greg's voice stopped mid-sentence. Through the doorway, Barbara could see him at his massive mahogany desk, still in his suit, despite the late hour, his laptop open and papers scattered across the surface like he was commanding a war room rather than a home. Aurelia, I'm in the middle of... He started, then stopped as he took in his daughter's costume, her flushed cheeks, the ribbon clutched in her small hands like treasure. The silence stretched so long that Barbara could hear the tick of the antique grandfather clock in the hallway. The play, Greg said finally, and the way his face crumpled told Barbara that he'd just realized what he'd done. "Oh, sweetheart, the play was tonight." "It's okay, Daddy," Aurelia said with the devastating forgiveness that only children possessed. "Miss Barbara came with me. She said I was the most beautiful princess in the whole kingdom." Greg's eyes found Barbara over his daughter's head, and the raw pain she saw there took her breath away. This wasn't a cold, calculating businessman who didn't care about his children. This was a man drowning in responsibility, trying to keep everything together and failing the people who mattered most. "Tell me about it," Greg said softly, closing his laptop and giving Aurelia his full attention. "Tell me everything." As Aurelia launched into an animated retelling of her performance, complete with dramatic reenactments that made her tissue paper dress rustle importantly, Barbara quietly withdrew to give them privacy. But she couldn't help hearing Greg's responses, the genuine interest in his voice, the way he gasped at all the right moments, the pride that colored his tone as he told Aurelia how sorry he was that he'd missed it. She was straightening up the kitchen when she heard footsteps behind her. "Barbara?" She turned to find Greg in the doorway, his tie loosened, his dark hair mussed, as if he'd been running his hands through it. He looked exhausted, defeated, and somehow younger than his 38 years. "Thank you," he said simply, "for taking her, for being there when I—" "Failed?" Barbara supplied gently. Greg winced. "Yes." Barbara studied his face, seeing past the successful exterior to the man underneath, the one who was trying to be everything to everyone and slowly destroying himself in the process. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Of course. When's the last time you ate dinner with your children?" Greg opened his mouth, then closed it, clearly trying to remember. "When's the last time you read them a bedtime story? Played a game with them? Asked them about their day without checking your phone?" Each question landed like a physical blow, and Barbara watched Greg's carefully constructed armor begin to crack. "I'm providing for them," he said defensively. "Everything I do is for them. The company, the money, their security." "They don't need your money, Greg," Barbara interrupted softly. "They need their father." The words hung in the air between them, challenging and true and impossible to ignore. "You don't understand," Greg said, his voice rough. "If I don't keep the company growing, if I don't stay ahead of the competition, you'll what? Have slightly less money in your bank account? Live in a mansion with only 15 rooms instead of 20? Barbara stepped closer, her dark eyes flashing with emotion. "Those children lost their mother. Are you going to make them lose their father too, just to a different kind of death?" Greg's face went white. "That's not fair." "Neither is leaving your 6-year-old daughter standing in the foyer in her costume, wondering why her daddy's business call was more important than her moment to shine." The truth of it hit Greg like a physical force, and Barbara watched him actually stagger backward a step. For a moment she thought he might yell at her, might fire her on the spot for daring to challenge him. Instead, he sank into one of the kitchen chairs and buried his face in his hands. "I don't know how to do this," he admitted, his voice muffled. "Elena was the one who was good with them. She knew how to make everything feel normal, happy. Since she died, I feel like I'm drowning, and the only thing I know how to do is work. It's the only place where I'm still competent." Barbara's anger melted away, replaced by something much more dangerous, compassion for this broken man who was trying so hard to hold everything together that he was falling apart. "You're not drowning," she said softly, moving to sit across from him. "You're learning to swim in water you never expected to find yourself in. But Greg, your children need you to stop treading water and start swimming toward them." Greg looked up at her, and the vulnerability in his steel-gray eyes made her chest tighten. "What if I mess it up? What if I'm not enough for them?" "What if you are?" Barbara challenged. "What if they don't need you to be perfect? What if they just need you to be present?" Outside, thunder rumbled in the distance, promising a storm that would match the one brewing in the kitchen. Greg stared at Barbara for a long moment, this woman who had walked into his perfectly ordered chaos and somehow made it feel like home again. "Teach me," he said suddenly. "What?" "Teach me how to be what they need. You see things in them that I miss. You know how to reach them in ways I don't understand. Teach me how to be their father instead of just their provider." The request was so humble, so raw with need, that Barbara felt her heart crack open completely. This proud, powerful man was asking her to help him love his children better, and she realized in that moment that she was already halfway in love with him for it. "It starts with showing up," she said softly. "Not just physically, but emotionally. When Aurelia tells you about her day, put down your phone. When Caspian asks you to look at his drawings, actually look at them. See the story he's trying to tell you. When Delphine has a nightmare." Barbara paused, something flickering in her expression. "What about nightmares?" Greg asked, leaning forward. "She's been having them. About losing you, too. Mrs. Henderson mentioned it, but Delphine made her promise not to tell you because she didn't want to worry you." Greg's face crumpled. "She's afraid I'm going to die. She's afraid you're going to disappear the way her mother did. Children don't understand the difference between death and abandonment. They just know when the people they love aren't there anymore." As if summoned by their conversation, a crack of thunder split the night, followed immediately by a terrified scream from upstairs. "Daddy!" Greg was on his feet and running before Barbara could blink, taking the stairs 3 at a time toward the sound of his daughter's terror. Barbara followed, her heart racing as another scream echoed through the house. They found Delphine in her bedroom, tangled in her princess-themed sheets, tears streaming down her face as she sobbed for her father. Without hesitation, Greg scooped her into his arms, holding her against his chest as she clung to him like he was her anchor in a storm. "It's okay, baby girl. Daddy's here. I'm right here," he murmured, rocking her gently as thunder crashed outside her window. "I dreamed you went away like Mommy," Delphine sobbed into his shoulder. "I looked everywhere, but you were gone and I couldn't find you." Barbara watched from the doorway as Greg's eyes filled with tears he refused to let fall. "I'm not going anywhere, sweetheart. Daddy's not going anywhere." "Promise?" Delphine pulled back to look at his face, her dark eyes wide with fear. "I promise," Greg said firmly. "But Delphine, if you're scared, you can always tell me. You never have to keep scary feelings secret, okay?" "Okay," she whispered, then noticed Barbara in the doorway. "Miss Barbara, will you stay too? Until the storm goes away." Barbara looked at Greg, who nodded gratefully. She settled into the reading chair beside Delphine's bed, while Greg continued to hold his daughter, and together they waited out the storm. Greg humming lullabies he hadn't sung since Elena died, Barbara occasionally adding her voice to his, and Delphine finally feeling safe enough to fall asleep in her father's arms. It was nearly midnight when they finally tucked her back into bed, and as they stood in the hallway outside her room, Greg turned to Barbara with something new in his eyes, something that looked like trust, like gratitude, like the beginning of something neither of them was quite ready to name. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for everything. For Aurelia tonight, for this conversation, for showing me what I was missing. Thank you for being willing to learn," Barbara replied, and the space between them suddenly felt charged with more than just the lingering electricity from the storm. For a moment, they stood there in the dim hallway, surrounded by the peaceful quiet of sleeping children and the sound of rain against the windows. Greg's hand lifted as if he might touch her face, and Barbara's breath caught in her throat. Then Caspian's voice drifted from his room. "Miss Barbara, is the storm over?" The spell broke, and they stepped apart, both of them breathing a little too quickly. "Almost," Barbara called back, her voice only slightly unsteady. "Go back to sleep, sweetheart. When she looked back at Greg, he was watching her with an expression that made her pulse race and her knees go weak. "We should talk," he said softly. "Tomorrow. About this." Barbara nodded, not trusting her voice, because this was no longer just about his children or her job. This was about the way he looked at her like she was the answer to questions he'd been afraid to ask. This was about the way her heart raced when he said her name. This was about the way they'd somehow become a team without either of them realizing it was happening. As Barbara made her way to her own room, she couldn't shake the feeling that everything had changed tonight. Greg Chaffee was no longer just her employer, and she was no longer just his children's nanny. The question was, what were they becoming instead? And what would happen when they finally found the courage to find out? Chapter 4. Small Hands, Big Plans. The Chaffee triplets had inherited their father's strategic mind, their mother's intuitive heart, and an absolutely diabolical talent for reconnaissance that would have impressed the CIA, which was exactly how they discovered that their father was falling in love with their nanny at 7:43 a.m. on a Tuesday morning. "Code Red," Aurelia whispered urgently from her position behind the kitchen island, where she was supposedly retrieving her dropped spoon, but was actually observing the way their father kept glancing at Miss Barbara like she was the most fascinating person he'd ever seen. "What's Code Red?" Caspian whispered back, abandoning his cereal to army crawl over to his sister's surveillance position. "Daddy's got the same look he used to get when he looked at Mommy's picture," Delphine explained with the wisdom of someone who had been paying very close attention to the adults in her life. "Except now he's looking at Miss Barbara that way." The three 6-year-olds exchanged meaningful glances that would have been impressive in adults, let alone children who still occasionally forgot to brush their teeth without reminders. "So Operation Cupid is working?" Caspian asked hopefully. "What's Operation Cupid?" Greg's voice suddenly appeared above them, causing all three children to freeze like deer caught in headlights. "Nothing," they chorused in perfect unison, which was exactly the kind of response that never convinced any parent. Greg crouched down to their level, his dark hair still slightly mussed from sleep, and his usually perfect shirt not quite as crisp as normal. Changes that had not gone unnoticed by his highly observant offspring. "You know," he said conversationally, "when I was your age, I tried to convince my father that the broken lamp was an accident. But I made the same mistake you just made." "What mistake?" Aurelia asked suspiciously. "I said nothing when he asked what I was doing, which is exactly what people say when they're definitely doing something." From across the kitchen came a soft laugh that made Greg's chest do something that felt suspiciously like a backflip. Barbara stood at the stove, making what appeared to be pancakes shaped like dinosaurs, and when she turned to smile at them, her face was lit with the kind of warmth that made Greg forget why he'd ever thought feelings were dangerous. "I think what the Hurricane Squad is trying to say," Barbara said, her eyes twinkling with mischief, "is that they've been plotting something that they think is very important and very secret." "We're not plotting," Delphine protested. "We're strategizing." "Strategizing what?" Greg asked, genuinely curious about what went on in the minds of his brilliant, devious children. Another meaningful look passed between the triplets before Caspian apparently decided that honesty was the best policy. "We think you should marry Miss Barbara," he announced with the casual directness that only children possessed. The kitchen went so quiet that the only sound was the sizzle of pancakes on the griddle. Greg felt his face heat up like a teenager caught passing notes in class, while Barbara suddenly became very interested in flipping what appeared to be a stegosaurus. "Oh," Greg managed, his usual eloquence completely abandoning him. "Well, that's direct. You like her," Aurelia stated matter-of-factly. "You smile more when she's here, and you listen to her differently than you listen to other people. And she likes you too," Delphine added helpfully. "She gets pink in her cheeks when you say her name, and she always makes sure you eat breakfast even when you try to skip it." Greg glanced at Barbara, who was indeed looking slightly pink and was determinedly focused on her dinosaur pancakes as if they required the precision of brain surgery. And Caspian delivered the killing blow with devastating 6-year-old logic. We need a mommy, and Miss Barbara would be the best mommy in the whole world. The spatula in Barbara's hand trembled slightly, and Greg saw her take a careful breath before turning around with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "That's very sweet of you to say," she said gently, "but sometimes grown-up feelings are more complicated than that." "Why?" all three children asked in unison. It was such a simple question, and yet Greg found himself completely unable to answer it. Why were grown-up feelings more complicated? Why couldn't he just admit that these past weeks with Barbara had been the happiest his family had been since Elena died? Why couldn't he acknowledge that he looked forward to coming home from work for the first time in years? That her laugh made him feel like the man he used to be before grief and responsibility had buried him alive? Because, Barbara said when Greg remained silent, sometimes people need time to figure out what they're feeling and whether those feelings are appropriate for the situation. "What situation?" Aurelia demanded. "You love us. We love you. Daddy loves you." "Aurelia," Greg interrupted softly, but his daughter was on a roll. "And you make him happy, and he makes you happy, and we all make each other happy. So what's complicated about that?" In the mouths of babes, Greg thought, staring at his daughter's earnest face. When had 6-year-olds become wiser than the adults? "I think," Barbara said carefully, setting down her spatula, "what your father and I need to figure out is whether we can be friends and work together without making things confusing for you three." "We're not confused," Caspian protested. "We want you to be our family, real family, forever family." The word forever hit Greg like a physical blow, because that's what he wanted too, wasn't it? This woman who made his children laugh, who saw through his armor to the man underneath, who had somehow made his house feel like a home again. He wanted her forever. But forever was a terrifying concept for a man who had learned that forever could end in an instant on a rainy Tuesday evening. "Tell you what," Barbara said, clearly sensing the emotional minefield the conversation had become. "Why don't we focus on today for now? And today I'm making dinosaur pancakes for breakfast." "Can we help?" Delphine asked, easily distracted by the promise of hands-on cooking. "Of course. But first I need my sous chefs to wash their hands and put on aprons." As the children scrambled to comply, Greg found himself alone with Barbara for a moment by the stove. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "They're not usually so direct about personal matters. They're children who lost their mother and want their family to feel complete again," Barbara replied, her voice equally soft. "There's nothing to apologize for. But putting you in that position, asking you to address their fantasies about Greg." Barbara turned to face him fully, and he was struck again by how beautiful she was, especially like this, with flour on her cheek and her hair escaping from its ponytail and her eyes soft with understanding. "They're not fantasies." His breath caught. "What?" "The way you look at me. The way I—" She took a shaky breath. "The way I look at you." "They're not imagining it." The admission hung between them like a bridge neither of them was quite ready to cross, and Greg felt his carefully constructed walls crumbling brick by brick. "Barbara, We're ready," Aurelia announced, returning with her siblings in tow, all three sporting child-sized aprons that were almost as long as they were tall. The moment shattered, but the words Barbara had spoken lingered in the air between them as she directed the children in the fine art of pancake artistry. Greg found himself unable to focus on his usual morning routine of checking emails and reviewing schedules. Instead, watching the easy way Barbara interacted with his children, the patient way she guided their small hands, the genuine delight in her laughter when Caspian's attempt at a triceratops looked more like abstract art. This was what he'd been missing, Greg realized. Not just help with the children, but partnership. Someone to share the small moments, the daily joys, the simple pleasure of watching his children learn and grow and be happy. Someone to share his life with. The thought should have terrified him. Instead, it felt like coming home. "Daddy," Delphine's voice broke through his reverie. "Come see my brontosaurus." Greg dutifully examined the pancake that looked more like a misshapen blob, but praised it as if it were a masterpiece, earning a gap-toothed grin from his youngest daughter. "Miss Barbara says you can't make good pancakes without putting love into them," Delphine informed him seriously. "So I put extra love in yours." "Did you now?" Greg asked, his throat suddenly tight. "Mm-hmm. And Miss Barbara put love in hers too, didn't you?" Delphine looked expectantly at Barbara, who was concentrating very hard on her pancake flipping. "I put care into everything I make for this family," Barbara said diplomatically. "Care is just love wearing different clothes," Aurelia announced, with the profound wisdom that children sometimes possessed. "Miss Barbara told us that yesterday when we asked why she always makes our lunches look so pretty." Greg looked at Barbara with new eyes, seeing the love she spoke of disguised as care, in the way she cut their sandwiches into fun shapes, in the encouraging notes she tucked into their backpacks, in the way she stayed up late helping Caspian with the school project, even though it wasn't technically part of her job description. She loved his children. And if he was being honest with himself, they weren't the only ones. "You know what I think?" Caspian said suddenly, syrup dripping from his chin as he worked through his own dinosaur creation. "What do you think?" Greg asked. "I think we should have a family meeting to talk about important stuff." "What kind of important stuff?" Barbara asked, clearly sensing danger. "Like whether Miss Barbara wants to be our real mom, and whether Daddy wants to marry her, and whether we can have a baby brother or sister to complete our family," Caspian stated with the matter-of-fact delivery of someone presenting a quarterly report. Greg choked on his coffee while Barbara turned approximately the same color as the strawberries on top of the pancakes. "Caspian Chaffee," Greg managed when he could speak again. "You cannot just plan other people's entire lives over breakfast." "Why not?" all three children asked in unison, clearly seeing no flaws in their logic. And honestly, Greg was starting to wonder the same thing. Why not? Why couldn't love be as simple as his children made it seem? Why couldn't he just admit that Barbara had become essential to his happiness, that the thought of her leaving made his chest tight with panic, that somewhere between the cricket incident and the dinosaur pancakes, he'd fallen completely and utterly in love with her? "Because," Barbara said gently, rescuing him from his internal crisis, "big decisions like that need time and conversation and making sure everyone understands what they're agreeing to." "So you're not saying no?" Aurelia pressed hopefully. Barbara's eyes met Greg's across the kitchen, and in them he saw hope and fear and longing and something that looked suspiciously like love. "I'm saying," Barbara replied carefully, "that some things are worth taking time to get exactly right." And as Greg watched his children cheer and high-five each other as if they'd just won the lottery, he realized that Barbara Leslie had just given him the most terrifying and wonderful thing he could have asked for. She'd given him hope. The question was, what was he brave enough to do with it? Chapter 5. The Fortress Falls. The sound that shattered Greg Chaffee's perfectly ordered Saturday morning wasn't his usual wake-up alarm or the gentle chaos of children's laughter. It was a scream of pure terror that had him vaulting from his bed and running toward the backyard before his brain fully processed what was happening. "Daddy! Daddy! Caspian fell!" Barbara was already there when Greg burst through the French doors, kneeling beside the ancient oak tree where his 6-year-old son sat cradled in her arms, his face white with shock and his left arm bent at an angle that made Greg's stomach turn to ice. "Don't move, sweetheart," Barbara was saying in that calm, steady voice that had become his anchor over the past month. I know it hurts, but we need to keep very still until Daddy gets here. I was trying to get to the good branch, Caspian whimpered, tears streaming down his dirt-streaked cheeks. The one where Mommy used to sit with us. I wanted to see if I could see heaven from there. The words hit Greg like a physical blow. Elena had indeed loved that tree, spending countless hours in its branches with the children when they were smaller, telling them stories about how the highest branches were portals to magical kingdoms. She'd made them promise never to climb without adult supervision, a promise apparently forgotten in a 6-year-old's desperate attempt to feel close to his lost mother. It's okay, Greg said, dropping to his knees beside them, his hands shaking as he gently touched Caspian's face. You're going to be okay, buddy. Daddy's here. I'm sorry, Caspian sobbed. I broke my promise to Mommy about climbing alone, and now I broke my arm too. Hey, no, Greg's voice cracked. You didn't break anything on purpose. Accidents happen and we fix them. That's what families do. But even as he spoke the reassuring words, Greg felt panic clawing at his chest. The arm was definitely broken, possibly badly, and Caspian was so small, so fragile, and what if… Greg, Barbara's voice cut through his spiraling thoughts, steady and sure. I need you to call 911 and ask for an ambulance. Tell them we have a 6-year-old with a probable forearm fracture, conscious and alert, but in significant pain. Can you do that for me? The calm authority in her voice snapped Greg back to the present. Of course. Barbara had been an emergency room nurse before becoming a nanny. She'd mentioned it briefly during her interview, but he'd been so focused on her childcare experience that he'd almost forgotten her medical background. While Greg made the call, Barbara continued her gentle assessment, her hands steady and professional as she checked Caspian's pulse and looked for signs of more serious injury. Aurelia and Delphine hovered nearby, holding hands and looking terrified, their Saturday morning play clothes forgotten in the face of their brother's pain. Is Caspian going to die? Delphine whispered, her dark eyes huge with fear. No, baby, Barbara said firmly, pulling the little girl close with her free arm while still supporting Caspian. He broke his arm, which hurts a lot, but doctors are very good at fixing broken arms. Your brother is going to be perfectly fine. Promise? Aurelia demanded, and Greg could hear the echo of all the promises that had been broken when Elena died, all the reassurances that had turned out to be worthless in the face of tragedy. I promise, Barbara said without hesitation, and something in her voice made all 3 children relax slightly. But he's going to need to be very brave at the hospital, and you two are going to need to be very brave too while Daddy and I take care of him. When the paramedics arrived, Greg watched in amazement as Barbara seamlessly transitioned from nanny to medical professional, providing clear, concise information about Caspian's condition and the mechanism of injury. She rode in the ambulance while Greg followed with the girls, and by the time they reached the emergency room, she had somehow managed to distract Caspian from his pain with an elaborate story about a brave knight who broke his sword arm while rescuing a dragon from a particularly troublesome princess. The next few hours passed in a blur of X-rays and consultations, of Caspian being remarkably stoic for a 6-year-old getting his arm set and casted, and of Barbara somehow managing to keep all 3 children calm and entertained in an environment that would have sent most kids into hysterics. It was nearly evening when they finally made it home, Caspian sporting a bright blue cast that he'd decided made him look super cool, and a prescription for pain medication that would hopefully let him sleep comfortably. All right, Iron Man, Barbara said as she helped Caspian into his pajamas, carefully maneuvering around his cast. Time for bed. Tomorrow we'll figure out how to turn this cast into the most awesome piece of superhero equipment anyone's ever seen." "Really?" Caspian asked, perking up despite his exhaustion. "Really? I'm thinking LED lights, maybe some flame decals, definitely a secret compartment for important spy equipment." Greg stood in the doorway watching this interchange, his chest tight with emotions that threatened to overwhelm him. Today had been his worst nightmare, one of his children hurt, fragile, in pain, and Barbara had been there, not just physically present, but truly there, competent and calm and exactly what they'd all needed. More than that, she'd been his lifeline. In the ambulance, when panic had clawed at his throat and worst-case scenarios had spiraled through his mind, she'd quietly taken his hand, her fingers threading through his with a certainty that anchored him to the present moment. At the hospital, when he'd been drowning in medical jargon and insurance forms, she'd seamlessly handled the details while he focused on what mattered most, comforting his son. She'd been his partner in every sense of the word, and the realization hit him like a physical force. He'd never felt more grateful for another human being in his entire life. After Aurelia and Delphine were also tucked into bed, with extra hugs and reassurances that their brother was truly fine, Greg found Barbara in the kitchen, finally allowing herself to sit down after the day's crisis. The soft lighting cast golden highlights in her dark hair, and the gentle curve of her neck as she tilted her head back against the chair made something primal and protective stir in his chest. "How are you holding up?" she asked, looking up as he entered, and the simple concern in her voice nearly undid him. "I should be asking you that," Greg replied, pouring 2 glasses of wine from the bottle he'd opened to celebrate Caspian's clean break and successful setting. His hands weren't quite steady as he handed her the glass, their fingers brushing in a contact that sent electricity racing up his arm. "You were incredible today. I don't know what we would have done without you." Barbara accepted the wine gratefully, taking a sip before responding. In the candlelight, when had he lit candles? Her skin seemed to glow with an inner warmth that made his mouth go dry. "You would have done exactly what any loving father would do," she said softly. "You would have taken care of your son." "I was falling apart," Greg admitted, moving to sit across from her at the kitchen island, though every instinct screamed at him to close the distance between them. "When I saw him lying there, when I saw how badly he was hurt, I couldn't think. I couldn't function. You saved us today, Barbara. You saved me. Greg, no, let me say this." He set down his wine glass and looked directly into her dark eyes, seeing his own desire reflected there like a mirror. "Today made me realize something I've been trying not to acknowledge for weeks. You're not just the children's nanny anymore, Barbara. You haven't been for a long time." Barbara's breath caught, her lips parting slightly in a way that made Greg's control hang by the thinnest thread. "What am I then?" "You're the person who makes this house feel like home," he said, his voice dropping to that low, intimate tone that never failed to make her pulse race. "You're the one who knows exactly what to say when Delphine has nightmares, who can turn Aurelia's dramatic tendencies into confidence, who sees Caspian's curiosity as a gift instead of a problem." Greg paused, his heart hammering against his ribs as he prepared to cross a line he could never uncross. "You're the person I've fallen completely and utterly in love with." The words hung in the air between them, raw and honest, and terrifying in their truth. Barbara stared at him, her wine glass frozen halfway to her lips. "Greg," she whispered. "I know it's complicated," he rushed on, suddenly afraid she was going to list all the reasons why this was impossible. "I know there are professional boundaries and power dynamics and a dozen other things that make this messy. But today, watching you with Caspian, Seeing how naturally you stepped into the role of partner and co-parent and exactly what we needed, I can't pretend anymore that this is just about the children." Barbara set down her wine glass with trembling hands. "Do you think I don't know that? Do you think I haven't been fighting the same feelings every single day?" Greg's breath stopped. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that somewhere between the cricket incident and the dinosaur pancakes, I fell in love with your children. And somewhere between your breakdown in the kitchen and the way you held Delphine during the thunderstorm, I fell in love with you too." The admission broke something open in Greg's chest, some dam that had been holding back weeks of longing and need and desperate hope. "Barbara," he breathed, standing up so quickly his chair nearly toppled backward. She stood too, and suddenly they were facing each other across the kitchen island, both of them breathing hard as if they'd been running. "This is crazy," Barbara said, but she was moving around the island toward him even as she spoke. "Your children's nanny falling in love with their father. It's every cliché in the book." "I don't care about clichés," Greg said roughly, meeting her halfway. "I care about you, about us, about the family we could be." "Greg." He reached up and cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing across her cheekbones. "Tell me you feel it too. Tell me it's not just me." "It's not just you," Barbara whispered, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "It's definitely not just you." And then, finally, inevitably, Greg lowered his head and kissed her. It was nothing like the polite, careful kisses of his corporate social life, or even the passionate but familiar kisses he'd shared with Elena years ago. This was something entirely new, desperate and gentle, grateful and hungry, full of weeks of suppressed longing and the overwhelming relief of finally giving in to what they both wanted. Barbara's hands fisted in his shirt, pulling him closer as she kissed him back with equal fervor, and Greg felt the last of his carefully constructed walls crumble completely. This woman, this incredible, loving, patient woman who had walked into his chaos and somehow made sense of it all. She was his. They were each other's. When they finally broke apart, both of them breathing hard, Greg rested his forehead against hers. "What happens now?" Barbara asked softly. "Now," Greg said, his voice rough with emotion, "we figure out how to do this right. How to build something real and lasting and strong enough to weather whatever comes next." "And the children?" Greg smiled, thinking of his brilliant, scheming, matchmaking offspring who had seen this coming long before either adult had been willing to admit it. "Something tells me," he said, "that they're going to be absolutely thrilled." As if to prove his point, a small voice drifted down from the top of the stairs. "It's about time, Daddy." Greg and Barbara looked up to see three pairs of eyes peering down at them through the banister rails, all wearing identical grins of satisfaction. "Did you see the whole thing?" Barbara called up, not even bothering to sound embarrassed. "Just the good parts," Aurelia replied with the solemnity of someone who had orchestrated a major diplomatic victory. "So," Caspian added, holding up his cast like a trophy, "does this mean Miss Barbara gets to be our real mom now?" Greg looked at Barbara, saw the hope and love and cautious joy in her beautiful dark eyes, and realized that despite the chaos and complications and all the ways this could potentially go wrong, he'd never been more certain of anything in his life. "Well," he said, his arm tightening around Barbara's waist, "that depends on whether she'll have us." Barbara smiled up at him with such radiance that Greg felt his heart skip several beats. "Try and stop me," she said. And from upstairs came the sound of three children cheering loud enough to wake the entire neighborhood, which was perfectly fine with Greg, because he wanted the whole world to know that the Chaffee family was finally, truly complete. Chapter 6. Love in Bloom. Barbara Leslie had been kissed before, but she'd never been kissed while 3 6-year-olds provided live commentary from the staircase, which was how she discovered that falling in love with Greg Chaffee came with the world's most enthusiastic and vocal audience. "Daddy's really good at kissing," Delphine observed with scientific interest as Greg and Barbara broke apart for the second time that evening, both of them laughing at their persistent spectators. "How would you know?" Caspian demanded, carefully protecting his new cast as he leaned further through the banister rails. "Because Miss Barbara's face is all glowy, like the princesses in our movies when they find their prince," Aurelia explained with the authority of someone who had conducted extensive research on the subject. "All right, love experts," Greg called up to them, his arms still wrapped securely around Barbara's waist. "Bedtime. For real this time." "But we want to watch you be in love," Delphine protested. "It's better than Disney movies." Barbara buried her face against Greg's shoulder to muffle her laughter. "Your children are going to be the death of my dignity." "Our children," Greg corrected softly, and the possessive warmth in his voice made Barbara's heart skip several beats. 2 weeks later, Barbara was learning that dating a billionaire single father was nothing like the romance novels suggested, and everything like a beautiful chaos that she wouldn't trade for anything in the world. "Close your eyes," Greg said, his hands warm on her shoulders as he guided her through the penthouse toward what she suspected was either a romantic surprise or the site of the children's latest elaborate prank. "If this is another one of their tests to see if I'm worthy of joining the family, I should warn you that I already passed the spider in the salad exam and the fake phone call from the president challenge," Barbara said, allowing herself to be led. "This one's all me," Greg assured her, his breath warm against her ear in a way that made her shiver deliciously. "Though they may have provided consultation on the planning." Barbara could hear suspicious giggling from somewhere nearby, confirming that the Chaffee children were definitely involved in whatever was about to happen. "Okay, open them." Barbara opened her eyes to find the living room transformed into something from a fairy tale. Hundreds of tiny white lights twinkled from every surface, candles flickered on the mantelpiece, and a blanket had been spread on the floor in front of the fireplace, complete with an elaborate picnic that looked suspiciously like it had been catered from one of Manhattan's finest restaurants. "Greg," she breathed, turning to find him watching her with an expression that made her knees go weak. "This is beautiful." The kids insisted that indoor picnics are more romantic than restaurants because you can kiss whenever you want without people staring, Greg said, his cheeks slightly pink. "Their words, not mine." "We researched it," Aurelia announced, popping up from behind the couch where she'd apparently been hiding with her siblings. "On Daddy's computer. Romance requires ambiance and privacy and good food. And kissing," Caspian added helpfully, his cast now decorated with silver stars that Barbara had helped him apply. "Lots of kissing." "Also dancing," Delphine chimed in. "Daddy, you didn't forget the dancing, did you?" As if summoned by her words, soft jazz began playing from the sound system, and Barbara realized that Greg had thought of everything, including the soundtrack to their indoor date. "May I have this dance?" Greg asked, extending his hand with a courtly bow that made all 3 children clap appreciatively. Barbara accepted his hand and allowed him to pull her into his arms, swaying gently to the music, while their audience of 3 watched with the satisfaction of matchmakers whose plan was coming together perfectly. "This is either the most romantic thing anyone's ever done for me," Barbara murmured against Greg's chest, "or the most public courtship in history." "Both," Greg replied, spinning her gently. "Fair warning, privacy is not really a thing in this family. They've already started planning our wedding." "Have they now?" Barbara asked, trying to sound casual, despite the way her heart leaped at the word wedding. "Complete with a flower girl dress for Delphine, ring-bearer duties for Caspian, and Aurelia has appointed herself maid of honor/wedding coordinator," Greg said, his voice warm with amusement. "She's also picked out your dress?" chosen the flowers, and selected what she calls the perfect romantic location, which is the backyard under Elena's tree, so Mommy can watch from heaven and make sure I don't mess up my vows. Barbara felt tears prick her eyes at the sweetness of it, at the way these children had found room in their hearts for her without ever trying to replace their mother's memory. "That sounds perfect," she whispered. "So you're not running away screaming at the prospect of marrying into this beautiful chaos?" Greg asked, and despite his light tone, Barbara could hear the vulnerability underneath. "Greg Chaffee," she said, pulling back to look into his steel-gray eyes. "I've been in love with this beautiful chaos since day one. A little wedding planning by committee isn't going to scare me off." The kiss that followed was interrupted by enthusiastic applause from their audience, and Caspian's medical assessment that Daddy's face is glowy now too. The next few weeks passed in a whirlwind of stolen moments and family adventures that slowly but surely wove Barbara deeper into the fabric of their lives. There was the morning when she woke up to find Greg in the kitchen at dawn, making coffee for both of them and looking devastatingly handsome in his running clothes, leading to a conversation about their favorite morning rituals that somehow turned into a discussion of their dreams for the future. There was the afternoon when they tried to have a romantic lunch at an upscale bistro, only to receive a frantic call from the school about a glitter emergency in Delphine's art class that required both parents to come immediately. They'd ended up having sandwiches in the school parking lot while Delphine explained, covered head to toe in sparkles, that her volcano project had been more explosive than anticipated. There was the evening when Greg had planned a quiet dinner at home, complete with the children's promise to play quietly in their rooms, only to discover that playing quietly apparently meant staging an elaborate theatrical production of How Daddy and Miss Barbara Fell in Love, complete with costumes, props, and a stirring musical number that brought tears to both adults' eyes. "You know," Barbara said one night as they sat on the couch after finally getting all three children to bed, her head on Greg's shoulder while he traced lazy patterns on her arm, "most couples get to have their private moments actually be private." "Are you complaining?" Greg asked, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "Never," Barbara replied immediately. "I love that they're so invested in our happiness. I love that they want to be part of our story instead of just watching from the sidelines." "They love you," Greg said simply, "almost as much as I do." Barbara tilted her head to look at him. "Almost?" "Well," Greg said, his voice dropping to that low, intimate tone that never failed to make her pulse race. "Their love is pure and uncomplicated. Mine is—" He paused, searching for words. "What?" Barbara prompted softly. "Desperate," Greg admitted. "Grateful. All-consuming. You saved us, Barbara. Not just as individuals, but as a family. You took our broken pieces and somehow made us whole again." "Greg," Barbara whispered, overwhelmed by the raw emotion in his voice. "I never thought I'd feel this way again," he continued. "After Elena died, I thought that part of my life was over. I thought I'd had my great love, and losing it had nearly destroyed me. I never imagined that love could come in a different form, that it could heal instead of just survive." Barbara reached up to cup his face, her thumb tracing the strong line of his jaw. "You didn't just survive, you know. You built something beautiful here. You raised three incredible children who are loving and generous, and brave enough to open their hearts to someone new. That's not just survival, Greg. That's triumph." "Our triumph," Greg corrected, covering her hand with his. "Everything good that's happened since you walked into our lives has been because of you." "Because of us," Barbara insisted. "Because you were brave enough to let someone in. Because you trusted me with the most precious things in your life." Greg's response was cut off by a small voice from the top of the stairs. "Miss Barbara?" "I had the bad dream again." They looked up to see Delphine standing at the top of the staircase, clutching her stuffed rabbit and looking small and scared in her princess pajamas. "I'll go," Barbara said automatically, starting to rise, but Greg caught her hand. "We'll go," he corrected. "Together." And that, Barbara realized as they climbed the stairs hand in hand to comfort the little girl who had somehow become as much hers as Greg's, was what love looked like in this family. Not perfect moments or flawless romance, but the choice to show up together, to be a team, to build something strong enough to weather any storm. 20 minutes later, after Delphine had been soothed back to sleep with gentle reassurances and a collaborative bedtime story that involved a brave princess, a noble knight, and a magical kingdom where families were built from love rather than just blood, Barbara and Greg finally returned to their quiet evening together. "So," Greg said as they settled back onto the couch, "where were we?" "I believe you were telling me how desperate and all-consuming your love for me is," Barbara replied with a teasing smile. "Ah, yes," Greg said, pulling her closer until she was practically in his lap. "Let me refresh your memory." The kiss that followed was indeed desperate and all-consuming, full of weeks of growing desire and the kind of passion that had been building between them since that first night when they'd stood in the hallway outside Delphine's room and realized they were falling in love. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Greg rested his forehead against Barbara's. "I want to give you everything," he said roughly. "Romance and passion and quiet moments and grand gestures and a lifetime of mornings where I get to wake up next to you." "Greg," Barbara breathed, "I want to marry you, Barbara Leslie. I want to adopt you into this beautiful chaos officially and legally and in every way that matters. I want to give you more children if you want them, or travel the world with just the three we have, if that's what makes you happy. I want to build a life with you that's big enough for all our dreams." Barbara felt tears spill over her cheeks at the beautiful certainty in his voice. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, to which part?" Greg asked, his hands cradling her face. "Yes to all of it," Barbara said, laughing through her tears. "Yes to everything. Yes to you. Yes to us. Yes to this family we're building together." Greg's kiss tasted like joy and promise, and forever. And when they finally separated, Barbara realized that she could hear something that made her heart soar, the sound of 3 children at the top of the stairs, cheering loud enough to wake the entire building. "Did you hear that?" Aurelia called down. "She said yes. She said yes to everything." "Does this mean we can start calling her Mom now?" Caspian asked hopefully. "It means," Greg said, his arm tightening around Barbara as he looked up at his children, their children, "that we're going to be a real family." "We were already a real family," Delphine corrected with 6-year-old wisdom. "Now, we're just going to make it official." And as Barbara sat in Greg's arms, surrounded by the chaos and love and beautiful imperfection of the Chaffee family, she realized that Delphine was absolutely right. They were already home. Everything else was just paperwork. Chapter 7: Storms and Secrets. The first crack in Barbara's perfect world appeared on a Tuesday morning in the form of a phone call that Greg took in his office, with the door closed, his voice dropping to the dangerous tone she'd only heard him use with business rivals who threatened what he loved most. "What do you mean, concerns about my judgment?" Greg's words carried through the mahogany-paneled walls, despite his attempt at privacy, and Barbara felt a chill run down her spine as she helped Caspian with his homework at the kitchen table, the same table where they'd shared so many meals, so many conversations, so many stolen moments when the children weren't looking. "Is Daddy fighting with someone?" Delphine asked, looking up from her coloring with the intuitive worry that children developed when they'd already lost one parent to circumstances beyond their control. "Just a work call, sweetheart," Barbara said gently, though her own stomach was twisting with an unease she couldn't shake. Greg had been fielding more calls lately, tense conversations that ended with him running his hands through his dark hair and staring out the floor-to-ceiling windows at Central Park with the expression of a man preparing for war. When Greg emerged from his office 20 minutes later, his jaw was set in a way that reminded Barbara forcibly that this gentle father and passionate lover was also a billionaire who hadn't built his empire by being soft. The charcoal suit that had looked so elegant this morning now seemed like armor, and the steel in his gray eyes spoke of battles fought in boardrooms where mercy was a luxury few could afford. "Everything all right?" she asked, keeping her voice light for the children's benefit while studying the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands clenched and unclenched at his sides. "Fine," Greg said tersely, then seemed to realize how that sounded and forced a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Just some business complications. Nothing that won't resolve itself." But Barbara had spent enough time reading people's faces, first as an ER nurse dealing with patients who lied about their pain levels, then as a nanny navigating the complex emotional landscapes of children who couldn't always voice their fears, to know when someone was lying to protect her. The sick feeling in her stomach only grew stronger. The second crack appeared that afternoon when she picked up Aurelia from Madison Preparatory Academy, where tuition cost more than most people's annual salaries and where the other mothers wore jewelry that could fund small countries. Barbara had never particularly cared about the social politics of Manhattan's elite parenting circles, but today the whispers seemed more pointed, the glances more calculating. Mrs. Pemberton, Aurelia's best friend's mother, a woman whose husband owned half of Wall Street, suddenly developed an urgent need to check her phone rather than make eye contact. Mrs. Vanderberg, who usually stopped to chat about weekend play-date arrangements, hurried past with the kind of studied indifference that spoke volumes. Even the school's headmistress, Dr. Whitmore, offered only a tight smile instead of her usual warm greeting. "Mama Barb," Aurelia said as they walked to the car, using the name she'd started calling Barbara since the engagement, "why was Madison's mommy being weird to you?" "What do you mean, sweetheart?" "She kept looking at you funny and whispering to the other mommies, like when kids are being mean but trying not to get caught." Barbara's heart sank. If 6-year-old Aurelia could sense the social undercurrents, then whatever was happening was more serious than she'd feared. In this rarefied world of private schools and charity galas, reputation was currency, and someone was working very hard to devalue hers. The third crack, the one that threatened to shatter everything, came that evening when Greg arrived home 3 hours later than usual, his face gray with exhaustion and something that looked suspiciously like defeat. His usually perfect appearance was disheveled, his tie askew, and when he looked at her, Barbara saw something that made her blood run cold. Doubt. "We need to talk," he said quietly, and those 4 words had never sounded more ominous. After the children were in bed, Greg poured himself a scotch, Macallan 25, a bottle that cost more than most cars and which he only opened for the worst occasions, with hands that trembled almost imperceptibly, and sat across from Barbara at the kitchen island where they'd shared so many meals, so many conversations, so many stolen kisses when the children weren't looking. "Stellan Montgomery has been busy," Greg said without preamble, and his voice carried the kind of controlled fury that suggested he was barely keeping himself in check. Barbara felt ice form in her veins. Stellan Montgomery was Greg's oldest business rival, a man who'd been trying to orchestrate a hostile takeover of Chaffee Technologies for the better part of 2 years. She'd met him once at a company function, a tall, silver-haired man with the kind of cold charisma that suggested he'd sell his own mother for the right stock option. He'd looked at her like she was a puzzle to be solved rather than a person to be met, and something in his pale blue eyes had made her skin crawl. "What kind of busy?" she asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. "The kind that involves private investigators, carefully leaked information, and a comprehensive psychological profile designed to raise questions about my personal judgment, Greg said, his voice carefully controlled in the way it got when he was absolutely furious but trying not to show it. Apparently, the board is concerned about my recent distractions. Distractions. Barbara's voice was flat. You mean me? Greg's silence was answer enough. What did he find? Barbara asked, and realized she was holding her breath. Everything, Greg said quietly, and the word landed like a death sentence. Your family, the accident, the reason you left emergency medicine, the reason you became a nanny instead of continuing your medical career, the therapy sessions, the medication you took for PTSD, even your credit score and the fact that you donated your parents' life insurance money to a scholarship fund instead of keeping it. Barbara felt the blood drain from her face. She'd told Greg some of it, but not all. Not the details that still woke her up in cold sweats, not the guilt that had driven her away from the career she'd loved, not the reason she'd spent the last 3 years taking care of other people's children instead of dealing with her own grief. Greg, I can explain. Can you? His voice was sharper than she'd ever heard it directed at her, and she realized with growing horror that this was how Greg Chaffee spoke to adversaries in boardrooms, cold, calculating, utterly without mercy. Can you explain why you never mentioned that you were driving the car when your family died? That you were the only survivor of an accident that killed your parents and your sister? The words hit Barbara like physical blows, each one finding its mark with devastating accuracy. She could see it in Greg's eyes. Not condemnation, but the terrible understanding of someone who'd also lost the people he loved most. And underneath that understanding, something worse. Doubt. It wasn't my fault, Barbara said, her voice breaking. The other driver ran a red light. I couldn't have. There was nothing I could have done. I know that, Greg said softly, and his voice carried genuine pain. The police report was clear. The accident was absolutely not your fault. But Barbara, you've been living with us for months. You've been taking care of my children, becoming part of our family, and you never told me that you'd lost your own family in a car accident. Because it wasn't relevant. Wasn't relevant? Greg's voice rose slightly before he caught himself, glancing toward the stairs where their children slept. You don't think it's relevant that the woman I've fallen in love with, the woman I want to marry, the woman I'm trusting with my children's hearts, has been carrying around trauma that's significant. Barbara felt tears spill down her cheeks. I was protecting you, protecting them. I know what it's like to love someone and lose them, Greg. I know what that kind of grief does to a family. I didn't want to burden you with mine. That's not your choice to make, Greg said, and the quiet devastation in his voice was worse than if he'd shouted. We're supposed to be partners, Barbara. Partners don't hide things like that from each other. I wasn't hiding it. You were what? Planning to tell me after we were married? After the children were even more attached to you? What happens the next time there's a crisis, Barbara? What happens when one of them gets hurt and you freeze up because it reminds you of your family? The accusation hung in the air between them, cruel and sharp and designed to cut deep. Barbara flinched as if he'd slapped her. That's not fair, she whispered. I've never let my past interfere with caring for your children. Not once. Haven't you? Greg asked, and his voice was getting colder, more distant with every word. Or have you been using us to heal yourself, playing house with my family because you can't face the fact that yours is gone? Barbara stood up so quickly her chair scraped against the floor. How dare you? How dare you suggest that my love for you and those children is some kind of grief therapy? Then what is it? Greg demanded, standing as well. Because right now I don't know what's real and what's just a broken woman trying to rebuild her life with someone else's family. The words hit Barbara like a physical blow, and she actually stumbled backward. For a moment she couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't do anything but stare at the man she loved as he systematically destroyed everything they'd built together. "Is that really what you think?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "After everything we've shared, after the way I love your children, after the way I love you, you think I'm just using you to avoid dealing with my own pain?" Greg's face crumpled slightly as if he was realizing what he'd just said, but the damage was already done. "I don't know what to think," he said quietly. "Montgomery's people have been very thorough. They have medical records showing that you left emergency medicine after the accident, that you've been in therapy for survivor's guilt, that you haven't had a serious relationship since your family died. From the outside, it looks like—" "Like what?" Barbara demanded. "Like I'm some damaged woman who latched on to the first man who showed her kindness? Like I'm incapable of genuine love because I'm still grieving people I lost 3 years ago?" Each question landed like a bullet, and Barbara watched Greg's carefully constructed armor begin to crack. "I don't know what to think," he said quietly. "Montgomery's people have been very thorough. They have medical records showing that you left emergency medicine after the accident, that you've been in therapy for survivor's guilt, that you haven't had a serious relationship since your family died. From the outside, it looks like—" "Like what?" Barbara demanded. "Like I'm some damaged woman who latched on to the first man who showed her kindness? Like I'm incapable of genuine love because I'm still grieving people I lost 3 years ago?" "Barbara, that's not what I meant." "Yes, it is." Barbara's voice was steady now, cold with the kind of hurt that went bone deep. "That's exactly what you meant, and you know what the worst part is. You're letting Stellan Montgomery dictate how you see me. You're letting a man who wants to destroy you convince you that the woman who loves you and your children is just another threat to manage." Greg flinched. "That's not, isn't it? You've spent this entire conversation telling me why I can't be trusted, why my love isn't real, why my presence in your life is somehow suspect." Barbara was crying now, but her voice remained steady. "You haven't once asked me how I feel, what this means to me, whether I need support in dealing with what Montgomery's done. You've just assumed the worst." "Barbara, please." "No." Barbara shook her head, backing toward the doorway. "You've made it very clear how you really see me, Greg, as a liability, as someone whose emotional baggage makes her unfit to be part of your perfect family. That's not true. Then why does it feel like you're already planning how to let me go?" Greg's silence was answer enough. Barbara stood there for another moment, memorizing his face, the kitchen where they'd shared so many happy moments, the life she'd thought they were building together. Then she turned and walked toward the stairs. "Where are you going?" Greg called after her. "To pack," Barbara said without turning around, "because clearly Stellan Montgomery doesn't have to work very hard to destroy us. We're doing it just fine on our own." As Barbara climbed the stairs toward her room, she could hear Greg following behind her, his voice urgent and pleading as he tried to take back words that couldn't be unsaid. But it was too late. The damage was done, and they both knew it. In the morning, she would resign. She would pack her things and leave this family she'd grown to love more than her own life. Because Greg was right about one thing. The children deserved better than someone whose presence brought chaos and doubt into their father's life. They deserved someone who could love them without complication, without baggage, without the constant threat of outside forces using that love as a weapon. They deserved someone who wasn't her. But as Barbara closed her bedroom door and began to pull her suitcase from the closet, she couldn't help but think that what they deserved most of all was a father who was brave enough to fight for love instead of running from it. And she wasn't sure Greg Chaffee was that man after all. Chapter 8. When Love Breaks. The sound of Barbara packing was quietly devastating. Each piece of clothing folded with military precision, each book placed carefully in boxes, each trace of her presence in their lives methodically erased, as if she'd never existed at all. Greg stood in the doorway of what had been her room, watching the woman he loved dismantle their future with the same calm efficiency she'd brought to every crisis they'd faced together. The irony wasn't lost on him that she was handling their breakup exactly the way she'd handled Caspian's broken arm, with competence, grace, and a steadiness that made him feel like he was drowning. "Barbara, please," he said for the 10th time that morning. "Can we just talk about this?" She didn't look up from the suitcase where she was carefully arranging the collection of small gifts the children had made for her over the months: drawings, clay sculptures, handwritten notes declaring their love. Her movements were precise, controlled, but Greg could see the tremor in her hands that gave away the emotion she was fighting to contain. "There's nothing left to talk about," she said quietly. "You've made your position very clear." "My position was wrong. I was scared and I said things I didn't mean. Didn't you?" Barbara finally looked up, and the pain in her dark eyes hit Greg like a physical blow. "Because it sounded like you'd been thinking those things for a while. It sounded like Stellan Montgomery just gave you permission to voice doubts you'd already been having." Greg opened his mouth to deny it, then stopped. Because hadn't there been moments, late at night when he couldn't sleep, when he'd wondered if their love was too good to be true? Hadn't there been a part of him that questioned whether someone as perfect as Barbara could really want his chaotic life permanently? His silence was answer enough. "That's what I thought," Barbara said, returning to her packing. "Greg, I understand why you're frightened. I understand why trust is hard for you, but I can't be in a relationship where I'm constantly having to prove that my love is real." "You shouldn't have to," Greg said quietly. "I know that. I know I screwed this up beyond repair." "Yes, you did." Barbara's voice was steady, but Greg could see tears tracking down her cheeks. "But not in the way you think." "What do you mean?" Barbara closed her suitcase and turned to face him fully. "You screwed up when you decided that protecting your children meant pushing away the person who loves them most. You screwed up when you let Stellan Montgomery convince you that love is a weakness instead of strength. And you screwed up when you forgot that real partnerships require faith in each other, especially when the rest of the world is trying to tear you apart." The words hit Greg like bullets, each one finding its mark with devastating accuracy. "Barbara? Miss Barbara?" Delphine's small voice interrupted from the hallway. "Why are you putting your things in boxes?" Greg turned to see all three children standing in the doorway, still in their pajamas, looking confused and increasingly frightened as they took in the scene before them. "Are you going on a trip?" Caspian asked hopefully, his cast-covered arm clutched protectively against his chest. Barbara knelt down to their level, and Greg watched her face transform from hurt and anger to gentle love as she looked at his children, their children. "I'm going away for a while, sweetheart," she said softly. "How long is a while?" Aurelia demanded, her voice taking on the edge of panic that Greg had heard too often in the months after Elena died. "I don't know," Barbara admitted, and Greg could hear the tears she was trying to hold back. "But you're coming back, right?" Delphine's voice was very small. "You promised you wouldn't leave like Mommy did." The sob that escaped Barbara's throat was quiet but devastating. "Oh, baby, I'm not leaving because I want to. I'm leaving because sometimes grown-ups make mistakes that hurt the people they love, and the only way to fix it is to go away for a while." "What mistake?" Caspian asked. "We can help you fix it. We're good at fixing things." "Like when we broke Daddy's vase and we used super glue and it was even prettier than before," Aurelia added earnestly. Barbara looked up at Greg with an expression that broke his heart completely. These children, their children, were offering to fix the mess that he had created with his fear and his doubt and his willingness to believe the worst instead of fighting for the best. "Some things can't be fixed with super glue," Barbara said gently. "Some things need More time. How much time? Delphine pressed. I don't know, sweetheart. Are you leaving because of something we did? Caspian asked, and the guilt in his young voice made Greg's chest tighten painfully. No, Barbara said firmly, pulling all three children into a fierce hug. This has nothing to do with you three. You are the most wonderful children in the entire world, and I love you more than all the stars in the sky. Don't you ever think this is your fault? Then why? Aurelia demanded. If you love us and we love you and Daddy loves you, why do you have to go away? Barbara's eyes met Greg's over the children's heads, and he could see the challenge there, the question she was leaving for him to answer. Because how could he explain to his children that he'd destroyed their family because he was afraid of losing it? How could he tell them that their father was a coward who had chosen fear over faith? Because, Greg said finally, his voice hoarse, Daddy made a mistake. A big one. And Miss Barbara needs some time to decide if she can forgive me. The children turned to stare at him with identical expressions of disappointment that cut deeper than any boardroom confrontation ever could. What kind of mistake? Caspian asked. The worst kind, Greg admitted. I forgot that love means trusting each other, even when scary things happen. I forgot that families stick together even when other people try to break them apart. So fix it, Aurelia said with 6-year-old logic. Say you're sorry and promise not to do it again. I did say I'm sorry, Greg said quietly. But sometimes sorry isn't enough. Then what is enough? Delphine demanded. Greg looked at Barbara, memorizing her face one last time before she walked out of their lives. I don't know, baby. I don't know. An hour later, Greg stood at the window of his home office, watching Barbara's taxi disappear into Manhattan traffic. The children had cried, great heaving sobs that reminded him forcibly of the months after Elena's death, and were now in their rooms, processing this latest abandonment in the way that children do when the adults in their lives fail them. Mrs. Henderson had been icily polite as she'd helped Barbara carry her boxes to the car, her disapproval radiating from every line of her body. Before leaving, she'd turned to Greg with an expression he'd never seen before. In all my years working for this family, she'd said quietly, I've never been more disappointed in you, Mr. Chaffee. That woman loved you and those children with everything she had, and you threw it away because you were afraid. Now, alone in his office, Greg finally allowed himself to break down. The sobs that escaped him were raw and desperate, the sound of a man who had everything and had destroyed it through his own cowardice. His phone buzzed, a text from Stellan Montgomery that simply read, Heard your nanny problem resolved itself. Looking forward to our board meeting next week. Greg stared at the message, feeling rage build in his chest like a physical force. This man, this soulless predator, had orchestrated the destruction of his family for business gain. And Greg had let him do it. Worse, he'd helped him do it by doubting the one person who had never given him reason to doubt. For the next 2 months, Greg threw himself into work with a vengeance that impressed even his most dedicated employees. He fought Stellan's takeover attempt with every weapon in his considerable arsenal, using tactics that would have made his business school professors proud and his conscience cringe. He won, of course. Stellan Montgomery was ruthless but not particularly creative, and Greg had decades of experience in corporate warfare. But victory felt hollow when there was no one to share it with. The children grieved openly and angrily, asking daily when Barbara was coming home, whether Daddy had fixed his mistake yet, why love had to be so complicated when it felt so simple to them. Greg hired 3 different nannies in 8 weeks. The first quit after Aurelia started a campaign of silent treatment so effective it made the woman question her career choice. The second lasted exactly 2 days before Caspian's helpful commentary about how she wasn't Barbara became too much to bear. The third was actually competent and kind, but Delphine took one look at her and burst into tears, sobbing that she didn't want a new nanny. She wanted their Barbara back. Greg found himself checking Barbara's social media obsessively, though she rarely posted. He knew from the little information he could gather that she'd taken a position with a family in San Francisco, that she seemed to be settling into a new life 3,000 miles away from the chaos she'd left behind in New York. He wondered if she thought about them. He wondered if she missed the children as much as they missed her. He wondered if she ever forgave him in her heart, even if she could never forgive him in person. Most of all, he wondered if he would ever stop loving her. The answer came one night when he was putting Delphine to bed, and she looked up at him with Elena's eyes and said, "Daddy, do you think Miss Barbara knows we still love her?" "I hope so, baby," Greg replied, his throat tight. "Maybe we should tell her," Delphine suggested, "in case she forgot." And Greg realized that his 6-year-old daughter was braver than he was, because she was willing to reach out across the distance and the hurt to make sure that love was heard, even when there was no guarantee it would be returned. That night, for the first time since Barbara left, Greg allowed himself to hope. Not that she would come back, he had no right to expect that kind of forgiveness, but that maybe, somehow, they could find a way to rebuild what he had broken. Because Delphine was right. Love needed to be spoken, needed to be heard, needed to be fought for, and Greg Chaffee was finally ready to fight. Chapter 9: The Reckoning. The phone call that would change everything came at 3:47 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, exactly 2 months after Barbara had walked out of their lives, and it was Mrs. Henderson's voice on the other end that told Greg his world was about to collapse all over again. "Mr. Chaffee, you need to come home immediately," she said, her usually steady voice shaking with panic. "The children are gone." Greg had been in his office, working through another sleepless night, trying to distract himself from the empty silence that had consumed his penthouse since Barbara left. He was on his feet and grabbing his keys before Mrs. Henderson finished speaking. "What do you mean, gone?" he demanded, already running toward the elevator. "I went to check on them before bed. Delphine had another nightmare about Miss Barbara, and I wanted to make sure she was settled. All 3 beds are empty, and there's a note." Greg's blood turned to ice. "What does it say?" "Dear Daddy," Mrs. Henderson read, her voice cracking. "We have gone to find Miss Barbara and bring her home because you are too scared to do it yourself. We took the emergency credit card and our savings from the piggy banks. We will call you when we find her. Love, Aurelia, Caspian, and Delphine. P.S. We are not mad at you, but you need to be braver about love." Greg nearly dropped the phone. His children, his 6-year-old children, had somehow managed to leave the most secure building in Manhattan in the middle of the night, to embark on a cross-country journey to find a woman who lived 3,000 miles away. "How is that possible?" he asked, bursting through the penthouse door to find Mrs. Henderson pacing the living room in her robe, her face pale with worry. "The doorman on duty was new. Marcus called in sick," she explained rapidly. "The children told him they were going down to the parking garage to get something from your car for a school project. He believed them because they're very convincing when they want to be." Greg felt hysteria building in his chest. His brilliant, determined, absolutely terrifying children had inherited every ounce of his strategic mind and had used it to stage what amounted to a military operation in pursuit of love. "We need to call the police," he said, reaching for his phone. "Sir," Mrs. Henderson said gently, "you might want to check your phone first." Greg's phone showed 7 missed calls and 3 text messages, all from a number he didn't recognize. The texts made his knees nearly give out. "Hi, Daddy, it's Aurelia. We are at the airport and we bought tickets to San Francisco with the credit card. Don't worry, we are being very responsible. Caspian says to tell you that we asked a nice lady at the ticket counter to help us, and she said we need an adult, but we told her our aunt was meeting us there." Delphine wants you to know we packed snacks and her Bunny and Caspian's inhaler just in case. We love you. Don't be scared, we will bring Miss Barbara home." Greg stared at the messages, feeling a complex mixture of terror, pride, and absolute awe at his children's determination. They had planned this. They had researched flights, convinced airport staff, and were currently somewhere over the middle of America on a mission to reunite their family. "Mrs. Henderson, pack a bag," he said, his voice deadly calm in the way it got when he was about to wage war. "I'm going to San Francisco." "Sir?" "My children are right," Greg said, feeling something shift inside him, some fundamental change that made him stand straighter, think clearer, feel braver than he had in months. "I have been too scared to fight for love, but they're not scared, and they shouldn't have to fix what I broke." 3 hours later, Greg was on his own flight to San Francisco, having used every contact and favor he possessed to track down his children's flight, their destination, and the location of Barbara's new family. He'd also made several other calls, to lawyers, to private investigators, and to one particularly ruthless journalist who specialized in corporate corruption. Because if his children could be brave enough to cross the country for love, then he could be brave enough to destroy the man who had nearly destroyed them. The call to Stellan Montgomery came at 35,000 feet, over the crackling airline phone that charged $5 a minute and was worth every penny for the satisfaction in Greg's voice. "Stellan," Greg said pleasantly when his rival answered, "I hope I'm not calling too early." "Greg? What? It's barely dawn. What do you want?" "I want to discuss the interesting conversation you had with my head of security last month. You remember, the one where you offered him $50,000 to provide you with access to my penthouse security footage?" The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. "I also want to discuss the private investigator you hired to follow Barbara Leslie and the rather creative interpretation of her medical records that you shared with my board. Did you know that falsifying someone's psychiatric history and sharing it without consent is a federal crime? You can't prove—" "Actually, I can," Greg interrupted, his voice dropping to the dangerously quiet tone that had made grown men in boardrooms break out in cold sweats. "See, while you were so busy trying to destroy my personal life, you forgot that I've been playing this game a lot longer than you have. Every phone call, every bribe, every piece of falsified information, I have records of all of it. What do you want?" Stellan's voice had lost all of its usual arrogance. "I want you to withdraw your takeover bid. I want you to publicly apologize for the damage you've done to Barbara's reputation, and I want your resignation from Montgomery Industries by the end of the week." "You're bluffing." "Am I? Check your email, Stellan. The FBI takes corporate espionage very seriously these days." Greg ended the call and settled back in his seat, feeling lighter than he had in months. Stellan Montgomery was finished. The evidence Greg had been quietly gathering for weeks would ensure that. But more importantly, Greg was finally ready to fight for what mattered most: his family, his love, his future. By the time Greg's plane landed in San Francisco, his children had been missing for 8 hours and were apparently staging the most polite home invasion in the history of California. He found them at Barbara's new employer's house, a beautiful Victorian in Pacific Heights, where Barbara was caring for twin 4-year-olds whose parents were both doctors. According to the frantic phone call Greg received from Dr. Patricia Chen, 3 small children had appeared on her doorstep at dawn, explained that they were looking for their Miss Barbara and needed to fix their daddy's broken heart, and had been welcomed in by Barbara herself, who was apparently crying too hard to speak coherently. When Greg rang the doorbell of the Chen house, it was Aurelia who answered the door, looking remarkably calm for someone who had just orchestrated a cross-country rescue mission. "Hi, Daddy," she said matter-of-factly. "We found her." "I can see that," Greg replied, his voice only slightly shaky. Are you going to invite me in, or are we conducting family reunions on the front porch now? Aurelia stepped aside, and Greg walked into the most beautiful chaos he'd ever seen. Caspian was on the couch, his cast propped up on pillows, animatedly telling a story to two fascinated 4-year-olds. Delphine was curled up in an armchair, clutching her bunny and looking exhausted but triumphant. And Barbara was standing in the doorway to the kitchen, wearing jeans and a sweater he'd never seen before, her hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, looking exactly like the woman he'd fallen in love with, and absolutely nothing like the life she'd built without them. "Hi," she said softly, and that single word contained months of hurt and hope and love that had never really gone away. "Hi yourself," Greg replied, his throat tight with emotion. "I hear our children decided to take matters into their own hands." "Our children," Barbara repeated, and something in her voice suggested she'd caught the possessive pronoun. "Our children," Greg confirmed, stepping closer. "Because that's what they are, Barbara. Yours and mine. They've been yours since the day you walked into our lives, and they're going to be yours until the day we all stop breathing." Barbara's eyes filled with tears. "Greg, I was wrong," he said, closing the distance between them until he was close enough to see the flecks of gold in her dark eyes. "I was wrong about everything. Wrong to doubt you. Wrong to let fear make my decisions. Wrong to choose protecting my pride over protecting my family." "You were hurt," Barbara said softly, "and scared." "I understand." "No." Greg shook his head. "You were hurt too. You were scared too. But you didn't let that stop you from loving us completely, from giving us everything you had. I did. I let one man's poison convince me that love was a weakness instead of the strongest thing in the world." Behind them, Greg could hear their children pretending not to listen while actually hanging on every word. "Barbara Leslie," Greg said, dropping to one knee right there in Dr. Chen's living room, pulling out the ring he'd been carrying in his pocket for weeks. "I love you. I love you desperately and completely, and with everything I am. I love the way you see magic in everyday moments, the way you turn chaos into joy, the way you love my children like they're your own." Barbara's hands flew to her mouth, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I love the way you're brave enough to fight for what matters, even when I'm too much of a coward to fight alongside you," Greg continued. "I love that you came 3,000 miles away from us, but still couldn't stay away from taking care of children, because that's who you are, someone who loves fiercely and protects fearlessly and makes every life you touch better for having known you." "Greg," Barbara whispered. "I know I don't deserve another chance," Greg said, his voice breaking. "I know I broke something precious, and I have no right to ask you to trust me again. But our children flew across the country because they believe love is worth fighting for, and I want to be half as brave as they are." He held up the ring, a simple solitaire that had belonged to his grandmother, elegant and timeless and perfect for the woman who had become his everything. "Marry me, Barbara. Not because we're convenient for each other, not because the children need a mother, but because I need you. Because you're my heart and my home and my future, and I want to spend the rest of my life proving that you can trust me with yours." The silence stretched for a heartbeat, two, and Greg felt his entire future hanging in the balance. Then Barbara dropped to her knees in front of him, cupping his face in her hands with infinite tenderness. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes to everything. Yes to you. Yes to us. Yes to the beautiful, chaotic, perfect family we're going to build together." The kiss that followed was interrupted by cheering from 3 small voices and the sound of Dr. Chen quietly closing the kitchen door to give them privacy. When they finally broke apart, Greg slipped the ring onto Barbara's finger with hands that shook slightly from relief and joy and the overwhelming knowledge that he was the luckiest man alive. "So," Barbara said, her voice watery with tears and laughter, "what happens now? Now, Aurelia announced, appearing beside them with the authority of someone who had just successfully orchestrated a major diplomatic victory. We go home and plan the most beautiful wedding ever. And live happily ever after, Caspian added from the couch. Like a real fairy tale, Delphine concluded with satisfaction. Greg looked at Barbara, at their children, at the future spread out before them like a gift he'd almost been too scared to accept. "You know what?" he said, pulling Barbara to her feet and into his arms. "I think our kids might be onto something." And as their children chattered excitedly about wedding plans and homecoming celebrations, Greg held the woman he loved and realized that sometimes the bravest thing you could do was let yourself be loved in return. They were going home, all of them, together, finally. Chapter 10. Forever begins today. 6 months later, on a perfect Saturday morning in May, Barbara Leslie stood in front of her bedroom mirror and marveled at the fact that she was about to become Mrs. Greg Chaffee in what their children had declared would be the most perfect wedding in the history of everything. Sunlight streamed through the windows, casting golden highlights across the ivory silk of her wedding dress, classic lines, delicate French lace sleeves, and a flowing skirt perfect for dancing under the stars. "Miss Barbara, I mean, Mama Barb, you look like a princess," Delphine announced, bursting through the door in pale pink tulle, followed by Aurelia carrying a clipboard with military precision. "The flowers are perfect, the chairs are arranged exactly right, and Daddy is in the garden looking like he might throw up from being so happy," Aurelia reported. Barbara laughed, the sound bubbling up from pure joy. 6 months ago, she'd been broken, convinced her capacity for love had died with her family. Now she stood here about to marry a man who saw her scars as proof of strength rather than damage. Through the window, she could see the backyard transformed into a fairy tale. White chairs faced Elena's oak tree, draped with soft lights and spring flowers, creating a natural cathedral where they would promise forever. "You know," Aurelia said thoughtfully, "Mommy would have loved this." Barbara knelt to Aurelia's level. "Yes, she would have, because she loved your daddy and you three more than anything, and I think she would want all of us to be happy." Mrs. Henderson appeared, carrying a small wrapped box. "From Mr. Chaffee, with instructions that you're to open it now." Inside was a delicate gold locket with a photo of the four of them, all looking perfectly, completely happy. On the back, engraved in Greg's careful handwriting, "My heart, my home, my everything. Today and always." "Oh," Barbara breathed. "Here, let me," Aurelia said, fastening the chain. "This way you'll have all of us right next to your heart during the ceremony." What followed was Aurelia's carefully choreographed procession. First Delphine, scattering rose petals with solemn dignity. Then Caspian, walking slowly with the rings, tongue sticking out in concentration. Aurelia carried the bouquet like she was bearing the crown jewels. And finally, Barbara herself, walking toward the man who had become her everything. Greg's face when he saw her was worth every moment of doubt, every tear shed, every obstacle overcome. His steel-gray eyes filled with tears he didn't try to hide, and his smile was so radiant that Barbara felt her own tears threaten. "Hi," he said softly when she reached him. "Hi yourself," she replied. The ceremony was simple and perfect, filled with personal vows that made half the guests reach for tissues. Greg promised to love Barbara with fierce dedication, to trust her with his heart and children and future. Barbara promised to love his children as her own, to stand beside him through any storm, to build a home filled with laughter and love. But the most beautiful moment came when the minister asked if anyone had anything to add, and three small voices piped up. "We do," Aurelia stepped forward with authority. "We want everyone to know that Miss Barbara has been our real mom in our hearts for a long time. Today just makes it official." "And," Caspian added, We helped Daddy pick out the ring because we have very good taste in jewelry. And, Delphine concluded with 6-year-old wisdom, love is the most important thing in the whole world, and our family has the most love of anyone because we chose each other on purpose. There wasn't a dry eye in the garden as Greg and Barbara knelt to embrace their children, creating a circle of 4 that felt complete and right and forever. When they finally stood to complete their vows, the minister pronounced them husband and wife with joy in his voice, and Greg's kiss was soft and sweet and full of promises for all the years to come. The reception was elegant but relaxed, sophisticated but filled with childish joy that made even serious adults remember what it felt like to believe in happily ever after. Greg and Barbara's first dance was to At Last by Etta James, swaying together under string lights while their children watched with satisfaction. "Mrs. Chaffee," Greg murmured against her ear, "how does it feel to be officially part of this beautiful chaos?" "Like coming home," Barbara replied, "like the beginning of the best adventure of my life. Even when Caspian inevitably spills something on your dress." "Especially then," Barbara laughed, kissing her husband's jaw. "I didn't fall in love with perfection, Greg. I fell in love with your beautiful, chaotic, absolutely perfect family." "Our family," Greg corrected, spinning her gently. "Our family," Barbara agreed, and the words felt like a prayer, a promise, a celebration. Later, as the evening wound down, the 5 of them sat together under Elena's tree, watching the stars appear. "So what happens now?" Delphine asked, curled up in Barbara's lap. "Now we live happily ever after," Aurelia said confidently. "But what does that actually mean?" Caspian pressed. Greg looked at Barbara, then at their children, then up at the tree where Elena's memory seemed to bless their new beginning. "It means we love each other every day," he said softly. "It means we take care of each other and stick together through good times and hard times." "It means we keep being a family," Barbara added. "Not because we have to, but because we choose to, every single day." "And it means," Greg said, pulling all of them closer, "that this is just the beginning of our story." As they sat together, surrounded by lingering wedding magic and the promise of all the days to come, Barbara thought about the journey that had brought them here. The cricket incident that started it all, the broken arm that showed them how much they meant to each other, the crisis that nearly tore them apart, and the children who had been brave enough to fight for love. "I love you," she whispered to Greg. "I love you too," he replied. "All of you. Forever." And as the stars wheeled overhead and their children chattered about future adventures, Barbara Chaffee, wife, mother, keeper of hearts, knew that forever had never sounded more beautiful. The end. Epilogue. 1 year later. "Mama Barb, Papa, the babies are here." Barbara opened her eyes to find Delphine bouncing beside the hospital bed, followed by Aurelia and Caspian pressing close to Greg, all 3 staring in wonder at the tiny bundles in Barbara's arms. "Meet your little brother and sister," Barbara said softly. "Sebastian James and Sophia Elena." The names honored both families, Sebastian for Greg's grandfather, Sophia for Barbara's mother, and Elena to honor the woman whose love had made this family possible. "They're so small," Caspian whispered in awe. "Were we ever that little?" Aurelia asked. "Smaller," Greg said, settling on the bed's edge. "You 3 were tiny hurricanes from the beginning." "And now you're going to be the best big siblings in the world," Barbara added, watching the children look at their new brother and sister with pure love. "Can we hold them?" Delphine asked hopefully. "Of course, but we need to be very gentle." As Greg helped position the children to safely hold their siblings, Barbara felt deep contentment settle over her. Their family was complete, chaotic and beautiful, and absolutely perfect in every way that mattered. "I love you, Mrs. Chaffee," Greg murmured. I love you too, Mr. Chaffee, Barbara replied, watching their 5 children with tears of joy. Outside, snow was beginning to fall, but inside their little room, surrounded by love and laughter and the promise of adventures to come, it felt like the most beautiful spring day in the world. Their happily ever after was just getting started. The end.